Welcome everybody here. Welcome everybody online. My name is Marianne Hirschberg. I'm a colleague of University of Kassel, and I'm I'm honored to welcome our speaker, Professor Dr. Amos Goldberg from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Amos Goldberg is a professor in the Jonah Machover Chair in Holocaust Studies at the Department of Jewish History and Contemporary Jewry, and the head of the Research Institute of Contemporary Jewry at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. His work is immense. I just want to mention some books. So for me, in my latest research, most important, he published in 2017, Trauma in First Person, Diary Writing During the Holocaust. And not to forget, in the moment, he finishes a book on the Warsaw Ghetto in his sabbatical. In Hebrew, soon it will be published another book, 5 Critical Readings in Holocaust Memory. And together with Bashir, he edited a book on the Holocaust and the Nakba, a new grammar of trauma and history, published by Columbia University Press in 2018. Another editorial together with Haim Hazan was Marking Evil, Holocaust Memory in the Global Age, 2015 by Birken Books. I could talk for minutes, not even minutes, but maybe hours on Amos Goldberg's work, but I think that's not as interesting than listening to him now, so you have the word.
Thank you very, very much, Marianne, for this kind of introduction, and thank you, Aram and the Center for inviting me, and also for organizing this and technicalities. So let me begin by thanking all of you for this kind invitation to share with you some of my thoughts on recent debates on Holocaust, memory, anti-Semitism, and colonialism. It's really an honor to be here, and I learned about the center and I know more about Marianne's work, so it really ties up to what you do here and what you do there, or what you do here, what you do there, and I'm more than, not less than expressing in my thoughts. I'm really looking forward to the discussion to hear what your feedbacks. In my presentation, I will relate to Germany and Israel, but obviously I know much more about the latter, about Israel and Palestine, but mostly Israel. I know much more about the latter than the former, so about Germany. So you will correct me if I say something which is completely wrong. I should also stress that obviously, as the title of my talk is, I will present an Israeli perspective, not the Israeli perspective, which does not exist, of course. But what do I mean by an Israeli perspective? First, it means that I put Israel context, Israel-Palestine context, front and center as the major analytic framework. And second, that I present my own way of thinking as a Jewish Israeli, how I think through these issues, acknowledging that others, perhaps most Jewish Israelis, and also Arab Palestinians with the Israeli citizenship, would reflect on this topic in a different way. But what is actually a perspective? Linguistics teach us that the same utterance or the same words can bear very different meanings and enact very different speech acts in different contexts. They distinguish between the utterance, that is, the actual words that one utters, and the act of enunciation. Okay, so I'll ask, linguistics teach us that the same utterance, that means the same words, can bear very different meanings and enact different speech acts in different contexts. They distinguish between the utterance, the actual words that are uttered and act, and the act of enunciation. What do we actually do when one utters this word? So we say something, but so there's the meaning of the sentence or the meaning of the words, but we also do with words things. sometimes regardless of our own intentions. Let's take, for example, the meaning of the short utterance, the Holocaust is unique. And what do we actually mean when we utter those words, regardless of their truth value, whether it is unique or it is not unique? I think it is not unique, and I think there is no uniqueness. I mean, every historical event is unique, and every historical event is also has parallels and analogies to other, but there is a claim that the Holocaust is uniquely unique or is differently. I think it's nonsense, but but it's a debate. I'm leaving it aside, but I'm saying, what does it mean? Not literally, but what do we actually do politically when we say the Holocaust is unique? Well, it bears very different meanings in different times and in different places, and when uttered by different people. In Germany, since the mid-1980s and throughout the 90s and even thereafter, in the early 2000s, uttering such an utterance, again, regardless of its truth value, had meant more or less, we Germans are acknowledging our huge historical crime of the Holocaust and are willing to take responsibility for it. We do not want to banalize it and relativize it, and this is why we call it unique. And we do not also want to dilute our responsibility. It might have also very well meant that the speaker is very skeptic about German national ethnic identity and its unbridgeable Nazi rupture. And I have here Habermas in mind. It was an utterance, I mean, of course, it's a big generalization. It can never be true totally, but I think it has some capacity, what my claim. It was an utterance of humility in a way. In most cases, this would also position the speaker in terms of a speech act in the political left, at times even radical left. I think this has gradually changed in the last 2 decades or 3 decades. But before we contemplate about that, we should suggest that in Israel, it bears, for Jews in Israel, it bears precisely the opposite. In Israel, this same utterance, the Holocaust is unique, has always served to solidify a Zionist, an ethnic nationalist, I would even say exclusionary identity, which is based on a strong sense of ultimate victimhood. It serves to justify or at least shield any fundamental criticism of the exclusionary foundations of Zionism or the ongoing occupation. It actually means that Israel has a unique status among modern nations because it is an outcome of and an answer to a unique crime. Therefore, no matter what it does or what is the real balance of power between it and its enemies, mainly the Palestinians, it will always identify itself and demand others to identify it as an ultimate victim of a unique crime, and therefore as a righteous and vulnerable side in the conflict. Now let's go back to Germany. Gradually, in the 2000s, this utterance changed its meaning, and today, in many cases, this might mean in Germany almost the opposite than what it was meant in the 80s and 90s, as I described before. It might mean we Germans have acknowledged our unique wrongdoing to the Jews, but have very hard time. It's very difficult to discuss seriously German and European colonial crimes, as they are always less than the ultimate unique crime of the Holocaust. It might also mean that we Germans consolidate our national identity firmly around guilt, remorse, and memory of the Holocaust. And in a sense, it is a rather conservative political speech act, enacting political power and a sense of relatively solid identity. So whereas in the 80s, my thesis is enunciating this utterance was an act of acknowledgement, of taking responsibility, and of stepping outside of the German ethnic identity comfort zone. Today, in many cases, it might mean quite the opposite. It is an act of at least partial denial of the full scale of colonial crimes and Germany's responsibility for them, or Europeans' responsibility for them, as well as for consolidating a comfort zone of a firm liberal German identity which celebrates its fight against anti-Semitism, its special relations with Israel, and its support for the renewed Jewish community. From this vantage point, Germany can teach or can preach to the world how important it is to remember the Holocaust and what fighting anti-Semitism is, whether right or wrong. I mean, whether we accept the concept or not, but but in a way, whatever this means, taking the high moral grounds of being able to remember past crimes. Now let's bring the Palestinian perspective to, and I humbly say, to the extent that I can represent it. I'm not the one to represent it, but I think I can say something about it. And here I will use a concrete example. It is August 16, 2022, less than a year ago. The Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas is standing next to the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz. A reporter asks Abbas about the upcoming 50th anniversary of the Munich massacre and asks him, is he planning to apologize to Israel and Germany? Abbas, who could not understand why the Palestinians, who are the victims of the Israeli Nakba and occupation, should apologize to the mighty aggressor, responds angrily by saying, and I quote, "If we want to go over the past, go ahead. I have 50 slaughters that Israel committed, 50 Palestinian villages, 50 massacres, 50 slaughters, 50 Holocausts." Now, of course, this was triggered a scandal. Scholz, who was extremely embarrassed but failed to respond, came under attack by the German media. He later said he was disgusted by the remark and called Israeli Prime Minister at the time, Yair Lapid, in order to apologize to him, while the Berlin police had opened a preliminary investigation against Abbas for incitement of hatred. Now, I'm not saying that he was accurate, but the disproportionate response testifies that Abbas' words, who were wrong, were wrong, and I think with bad taste, but the disproportionate response testified not only that Abbas' words were not only perceived as words of bad taste or wrong, but actually violated the sacred uniqueness of the Holocaust and compared the uncomparable. Abbas' unfounded hyperbolic speech stumbled over the uniqueness of the Holocaust. For the Palestinians then, as much as I can say, and I think there's much right, I think this general thing I'm saying is correct. The utterance, the Holocaust is unique. What it enacts beyond its meaning is an oppressive mean in the hegemonic Western politics of memory to further marginalize the oppressed subaltern's politics of liberation and acknowledgement. We can also talk about the way the Palestinians were related in the documenta that took place here, but let's skip it. Even before it was open, even before anybody... So how can the same four words, the Holocaust is unique, bear such different meanings to different groups of people in different times and places? In order to understand that, we need to broaden our perspective. In a well-known article, Charles Meyer, historian of German history in Harvard, suggested that the second half, and especially the end of the 20th century, saw the development and proliferation of two great moral historical narratives in the West and beyond to explain modernity. Both are stories of historical catastrophe, the story of the Holocaust and anti-Semitism, and the story of anti- and post-colonialism and Western racism. It's more complicated. It also brings in the post-Soviet narrative, but let's keep it out of the question right now, our framework right now. These two, by now largely global narratives, have deep historical and intellectual roots in many parts of the world. A complex relationship developed between those two grand moral historical narratives. But ultimately, there is an inbuilt tension between them. The Holocaust story is Eurocentric and focuses on the Jewish genocide during the course of the Second World War, while the anti- or post-colonial narrative focuses on the crimes, including genocides, committed by Europe and the West against non-white population both outside and inside Europe. Despite a complex history of denial and avoidance, by the end of the millennium, the story of the Holocaust, again, is a very grand, those are huge generalizations that you can, of course, question me about them afterwards, enjoyed unprecedented recognition in the global history of memory, and it became an essential part of European and Western identity. Its victims were awarded compensation, absolutely deserved, but very generous by historical comparison. Again, I emphasize they are deserved, not undeserved. But in historical comparison, they are relatively high. The crimes of colonialism, on the other hand, are still debated and to a large extent denied by Western societies and government, and struggles for compensation have by and large not yet yielded significant outcomes. The two narratives convey very different political messages. The Holocaust story ultimately supports democratic liberal, sometimes neoliberal agenda of the late millennium and the beginning of the 21st century. Although until the 2000s, the Holocaust served in many Western countries as a self-critical and at times even subversive narrative, as we saw in Germany in the 80s and 90s, challenging European nations' ethnic self-image. In recent decades, it has paradoxically assumed a reassuring quality, inasmuch as it serves to strengthen Western identity and generate feeling of satisfaction about itself and its values, thanks to the culture of memory and remorse it has created around the Holocaust. The level of anti-Semitism, however it is defined, has become a litmus test for a level of threat to democracy and liberal values in any society. The anti- and post-colonial narrative is far more critical. According to this narrative, colonialism is a reflection of the imminent criminality of modern Western culture, even and perhaps especially in its liberal form. For liberal democratic regimes in various degrees have also been involved in violence, murder, oppression, and even the genocide of non-European people and societies throughout the world. I mean, you know, all the examples we can in America, in Africa and East Asia. This historical grand moral historical narrative persists in its criticism of Western liberal democratic societies even after the process of decolonization, due to their ongoing involvement, direct and structural, in the global South, and in light of their ongoing racist behavior, extreme violence, and criminal actions, including economic exploitation and murderous military interventions to this day. In this narrative, the radical political violence of Europe and the West is not an aberration like the Holocaust, but the actual norm, not a political threat, but a permanent realization. Hence, there is an inbuilt tension between these two narratives, and in a certain historical context, they have clashed head-on. Ronnie Mikel Arieli, has recently shown that is precisely what happened in South Africa during apartheid years, for example. However, it is on the subject of Israel and Palestine that these two global narratives appear to clash most forcefully and directly. Oh, thank you very much. According to the mainstream Holocaust and anti-Semitism narratives, and I make here again grave simplifications, the definitive answer to anti-Semitism and the Holocaust was the establishment of this Jewish state, of a Jewish state in Palestine, where Holocaust survivors can rebuild their lives and restore their dignity. The Arabs, and particularly the Palestinians who resisted Zionism, are oftentimes depicted as anti-Semites or even Nazis. The anti-post-colonial narrative views the struggle in Palestine in an entirely different light. According to it, Zionism is merely another case of settler colonialism and imperialism. The Jews who came from Europe under the auspice of the European powers did not come to integrate into the local society and body politic, but to replace it with their own political community. And according to this framework, the 1917 Balfour Declaration and the 1922 Mandate for Palestine, to which by the League of Nations, to which the Balfour Declaration gave rise, are two of the most criminal imperialist documents in the history of the region, because they gave the Jewish minority, or years before the Holocaust, at the time around 10% of the population. In 1917 there were 10% of the population, national rights in a territory that did not belong to the powers but to the indigenous inhabitants of the land, who were defined merely as a religious community. As in other cases of settler colonialism, the Zionist appetite for land knew no bounds and are always within this framework this narrative framework, always aimed to dispossess the native inhabitants. The ethnic cleansing of 1948, the Nakba, was an inevitable result of these eliminatory processes. Since then, settler colonial racist Zionist enterprise has never ceased to expand with overwhelming Western support, and the Nakba, which began as an ethnic cleansing of 1948 or possibly earlier, continues to this day. Both narratives contain more than a grain of historical truth and moral validity. The Palestinian intellectual Raif Zrek articulates this double vision very sharply, and I quote, and I think it's a very brilliant quote: "The Europeans see the back of the Jewish refugee fleeing for his life. The Palestinians see the face of the settler colonialist taking over his land." But as they are told today, they are both exclusionary, narratives on Israel-Palestine are exclusionary through and through. And as Omar, we can talk about it, why, and what are the mechanism of exclusionary mechanism. And as Omar Kamil observed, the rift between these two narratives on Palestine-Israel seems to be irreconcilable. I will now turn briefly to superficially suggest a partial genealogy of this clash. It is interesting to note that the rift between these two meta-narratives started very early, even before the Holocaust. Following the 1929 Arab-Jewish-British violence, which according to the historian Hillel Cohen was year zero in the Zionist-Palestinian conflict, Chaim Sokolov published a series of essays in the attempt to interpret the events from a Zionist point of view. Sokolov, he was a very prominent figure in the Zionist movement, served since 1921 as the executive chair of the World Zionist Organization And in 1932, he was nominated as the chairman of the organization itself, to be succeeded in 1935 by Chaim Weizmann, who will become the first president of Israel. So it's a very prominent figure. Sokolov was also acknowledged as an authorized voice on anti-Semitism. Already in 1882 in Warsaw, he published an influential, long-lasting book, Sinat Olam Le'am Olam, Eternal Hatred to Eternal People, on anti-Semitism, as I said, in Hebrew. Going back to his essay in 1999, which was the second, I think, eruption of violence in Israel-Palestine, in Palestine at that time, between Zionists and Palestinian Arabs. So it was the very beginning of this conflict, and people and intellectuals and politicians had to give some meaning to it. So he wrote an essay which was called Achraim, the ones who are responsible. One of Sokolov's main arguments is that the Arab violence, particularly in Hebron and Safad, are a typically East European anti-Semitic pogrom, very similar, for example, to the 1903 Kishinev pogrom. So you see how he actually implements a structural and linguistic framework from East Europe to the Middle East, to the Palestinian context. And he says, in fact, writes Sokolov, that in recent time, the active part of Arabs of Eretz Israel, which is Palestine, the land of Israel, was infected in the most radical way by what is called in other countries anti-Semitism. It is amazing to see to what extent they distort and castrate anything that has to do with Jews. Since long, they tried and also began to publish the falsified inverted scrolls of hostility of the elders of Zionism, classic anti-Semitism, which now this is says in 1929. It's ironic that he was so naive, which the European publicists abandoned in disgust. Yeah, it was 4 years before the Nazis came to power. If this is not anti-Semitism, we really don't know what anti-Semitism is. Sokolov goes on to reject the claim that the Arab violence, in part, is part of a national liberation struggle. He fails to even consider the option that it is an anti-colonial, an anti-imperial struggle, something other Zionist leaders did mention. We should also note that the connection that Sokolov made between the Arab resistance and anti-Semitism was not consensual, even within the Zionist movement. Ben-Gurion, and particularly Jabotinsky, who is the patriarch, the forefather of the right-wing revisionist movement in the Zionist movement, like the forefather of the Likud, which is now governing for the last 30 or 40 years. So Jabotinsky was really one of the most, I think, the sharpest, one of the sharpest and far-sighting, far-viewing leaders, wrote very clearly in 1923 in his famous and brilliant essay on the Iron Wall that he says, listen to this, my readers have a general idea of the history of colonization in other countries. So you understand that the situation in Palestine is a colonial situation, at least from the Arab point of view. I suggest that they considered all the precedents with which they are acquainted and see whether there is one solitary instance of any colonization being carried on with the consent of the native population. There is no such precedent. Every native population, civilized or not, regards its lands as its national home, of which it is the sole master. And it wants to retain that mastery always. It will refuse to admit not only new masters, but even new partners or collaborators. This is equally true for the Arabs. So he understands that from the Arab point of view, the situation is colonial, and therefore a war will be waged. Now he has his own justification, but he understands exactly how the Arab world, and in particular the Palestinians or the Arabs of Palestine at that time, how they view this immigration, Jewish immigration into Palestine. This view is of course, now again, he saw it, he acknowledged it, and he had his own justification for Zionist endeavor to create a homeland. What is that? I mean, not a what kind of a homeland, that was debated. He had his own justification, but he acknowledged that from a Arab perspective, it was a completely colonial endeavor. This view is, of course, much closer to how most Arabs understood the conflict with Zionism, and in the 20s and 30s. Many Arabs, including, and here I will rely on secondary literature, such as Khalil al-Sakakini, Yusuf Dia al-Khalidi, and Yusuf Khalikal, saw Zionism from its early stages, and particularly after Balfour Declaration in 1917, as a colonial movement and/or as part of British imperialism. Heikel, for example, called Zionism in his 1937 book, The Palestinian Problem, Analysis and Critique, this is the name of the book, he called Zionism a national, religious, colonial, and imperial movement. This view was also shared and propagated in 1929, when Sokolov wrote his essay by the Soviet Union, who supported this understanding and was echoed by Jewish-dominated Palestinian Communist Party in Palestine. This division continued into the Cold War throughout the 40s, 50s, and 60s, where the Zionists and the West perceived the State of Israel as a legitimate, not only and justified post-Holocaust entity, while the Arabs in the Soviet bloc viewed, and their supporters viewed it as a criminal, colonial, and imperial state, even if they had relationship with it. Now, we can talk about why Soviet Union supported 1948, supported the establishment of the State of Israel, but basically speaking, the rhetoric of the Eastern Bloc and Soviet Union was framing it within imperial history. Things started changing in the 70s with the rise of a new left in Europe. Following the 1967 and 1973 wars, and the subsequent oil crisis, and following the decolonization of most of Africa and East Asia, the anti-Zionist, anti-colonial, and Middle East, the anti-Zionist, anti-colonial narrative started gaining ground on the highest international stages and also in Western societies. An important milestone was Resolution 3379, which passed by the United Nations General Assembly in November 1975, condemning Zionism as, I quote, a threat to our world peace and security, end of quote, calling upon, again quote, all countries to oppose the racist and imperialist ideology, and further deeming Zionism, again I quote, a form of racism and racial discrimination. This resolution was a clear outcome of the Cold War, which determined the divide over the vote. The Soviet bloc, together with the Arab and most African post-colonial states, voted for it, while all Western countries voted against it. But still, as the UN is a global and universal institution, the resolution marked the beginning of this big tectonic shift in which the anti-colonial, anti-Zionist narrative broke out of the confines of the Soviet bloc, the Arab nations, and some Western, mostly Marxist intellectual, like the French Jewish Marxist historian Maxime Rodinson, and he's just one example. So things started to change in the 70s. In response, in the UN in November 1975, Israeli ambassador to the UN precisely framed it in the framework that I'm suggesting. And he, in opposing and objecting this resolution, brought the Holocaust. He dramatically tore the UN resolution from the podium of the General Assembly, noting in his speech the symbolism of the fact that it had been passed on the 37th anniversary of Kristallnacht. His speech was indeed infused with Holocaust symbolism and was devoted entirely to what he perceived as the anti-Semitic nature of the resolution. We should stress that in December 1991, at the end of the Cold War and the beginning of the so-called peace process, the General Assembly passed Resolution 4686, revoking Resolution 3379 and actually canceling the equation between Zionism and racism. However, the anti-colonial winds continued to blow in this clash. The next milestone event occurred 10 years later in 2001, a year after the outbreak of the Second Intifada, when an UN-sponsored World Conference Against Racism was being held in Durban, South Africa, a country liberated from apartheid only a few years earlier, in 1994. As Tarek Bakouni has recently indicated, the highly critical discussion before and during the conference were aimed at reviving the 1975 UN decision that equated Zionism and racism. Under pressure from the United States and other Western European countries, the resolution in Durban 2001 were far more moderate. But parallel to the diplomatic states conference, an NGO forum attended by representatives of some 3,000 human rights organizations from around the world was held in parallel to this diplomatic conference. This forum was dominated by the anti- and post-colonial discourse of the Global South. To a certain extent, it stemmed from a decade which witnessed the genocide in Rwanda and Bosnia, in which the post-colonial and human rights discourse emerged as major, powerful political and cultural global discourses. And you can think of Homi Bhabha. I mean, all the classics of post-colonial literature were translated to English or written in English during the 1990s, and also the most important periodicals, academic periodicals like Interventions and others were established during the 1990s. So it's accumulation of these processes. Hence, the articles of the Forum Declaration were extremely critical of Israel. In this document, which referred to many rights struggle around the world, really many. You can download it and you can see like every evil in the world is related to it. But Israel was deemed as a criminal apartheid state, an occupying power and a violator of human rights, accused of ethnic cleansing, even acts of genocide and racist crimes against humanity in breach of the Geneva Convention and UN resolutions. This attitude culminated in Article 424 and 425, calling for the, I quote, complete and total isolation of Israel, as with apartheid South Africa, and condemning states that failed to heed this call. It should be noted that the declaration, which is really, it's a huge document of the conference, as the conference itself, did not focus solely on Israel and Palestine. It dealt with very many other cases of human rights violation and oppression, including extensively this was the issue of that convention, slavery and compensation, where the states really refused they were willing to acknowledge, not to not to apologize, and certainly not to compensate. But that was another major, very major issue of that conference. It also warned against Holocaust denial and revisionism. But Israel-Palestine was still one major topic. In Durban, and differently from the 1975 UN resolution, some Western delegations, certainly in the NGO form, but also in the diplomatic ones, supported actively or passively these trends. So you see the movement, the anti or the critical is of Israel, what I call anti-colonial narrative, is drifting to international institution and to the West. Are you with me so far? Now, the reactions to the Durban, I think including what we see here in Germany in recent years, it's to a large extent, a reaction to an ongoing response to what happened in Durban, because it was a shock to Israel, to the government, and to many supporters of Israel and many Jewish organizations. Because, as I said, on the highest international arena, this settler colonial narrative was performed, and in a very vocal and straightforward, powerful way. Democratic US Congressman Tom Lantos, a Jewish Holocaust survivor from Hungary, felt that this was, and I quote, the most sickening and unabashed display of hate for Jews he had, end of quote, he had seen since the Holocaust. He thus gave expression to the view of very many Jews around the world, and not only Jews, the majority of Jewish and Zionist organization, and of course the State of Israel. The Palestinians and many of the other, mostly non-Western participants, obviously saw things differently. As Ariane El-Fased, who was a member of the Palestinian delegation at the NGO Forum, wrote, I quote, "Palestinians as victims of racism exercise their right to describe their experiences of racially motivated human rights violation perpetrated against them, and have done so with specific reference to international and human rights and humanitarian law standards and norms. No individual state should enjoy impunity for their crimes." So you see two completely different narratives come out of this Durban conference, which was a UN. It was really, it was, as I said, it was sponsored, and not only sponsored, initiated, sponsored, and by the UN and by the UN Human Rights Commissioner Mary Douglas at that time. The conference closed on September 8, 2001, just 3 days prior to the large-scale terror attacks in the USA on the Twin Towers and the Pentagon, what we call 9/11, which transformed the world beyond recognition. The series of dramatic events that played out over the following 2 decades accentuated this change. Among these events were the so-called war on terror declared by President George Bush Jr. and the ensuing invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq, large-scale terrorist attacks in Europe, such as in Madrid and London, the Arab Spring, what is the so-called Arab Spring, that evolved into bloody civil wars in several Arab countries, resulted in the rise of regimes even more dictatorial than those they were overthrown. And of course, the rise of ISIS and its ritual beheading that of course were screened all over the world, became beamed across the globe. The huge waves of the huge wave of refugees that reached Europe around arose great anxiety and the frightening level of xenophobia, and recently also, which changed the whole political setting also in the Middle East, that culminated in the Abraham Accords in the Middle East. This resulted in the return of nationalism and the rise of populist regimes worldwide, including, and this is very important because the alliances changed dramatically, including in the largest post-colonial state, India, which is very, I mean, we can talk about that later. So the shifting global political map toward the right and the disintegration of the ideological left in Europe and the destabilization of European Union. All these processes dramatically undermine the moral stature of the in the eyes of the West of the post-colonial narrative and robust commitment to the idea of global human rights. Okay. The narrative of the Holocaust and anti-Semitism, on the other hand, gained exceptional international legitimacy, and it was gradually grabbed also by the right. And gradually, the version of the narrative that emphasizes the universal values of human rights and the prevention of mass violence lost much of its potency to be replaced by a version that stresses above all the problems of anti-Semitism, uniquely anti-Semitism, and disconnected from issues of racism, and which regard opposition to Israel and to Zionism as the harshest contemporary manifestation of anti-Semitism against which one must fight. The international legitimacy of the Palestinian story, now associated with Western public opinion with terror and Islamic fundamentalism, on the other hand, was steadily eroded in Europe, in the USA, where now in America the winds are changing again, and in many other countries worldwide. This was, of course, a lengthy and complex process, but I think these were more or less its outcomes. Now let us return to the Durban Conference of 2001. And I forgot to mention, these were the first days of the Second Intifada. Let us return to Durban Conference. It was in this context, for example, that the NGO Monitor was founded. This organ would rapidly gain considerable worldwide influence as it sought to suppress and hound voices critical of Israel. Many of the organizations, the activists, and even the academics, both Jewish and non-Jewish, who would later take up arms against the BDS movement and brand criticism of Israel and Zionism and anti-Semitic, would mark Durban Conference as a turning point. In fact, also the BDS campaign itself, officially launched in 2005, also grew directly out of the Durban event, the conference. The BDS demands represent the mainstream Palestinian political consensus and was endorsed by numerous, more than 100 Palestinian civil society organizations. It is the current most influential anti-Zionist, anti-colonial manifesto, and it ties itself explicitly to the Durban NGO conference. Another very significant milestone in this fight of narratives, in the war of narratives, occurred in 2016, when the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, called IRA, abbreviated IRA, an international organization currently composed of 35 countries, adopted, following an aggressive campaign led by Israel and its allies, a definition of anti-Semitism that refers to some of the fundamental components of the Palestinian narrative anchored in the post and anti-colonial moral historical narrative, branding them as anti-Semitic. This definition, in fact, comprised a rather obscure this IRA definition, which is now over. Now there's a fight whether to adopt. The UN is now the arena whether to adopt it, but it was really adopted by many European and Western countries. It was adopted by many organizations, even some Arab countries or Arab organizations adopted it. And it's actually criminalizes anti-Semitic or anti-Zionism. Let's put it bluntly. For example, this definition is in fact, so it is built from a very vague core definition, and then it has 11 examples to explain what this definition actually means. And the 11 examples contain, out of 11 examples, 7 relate to Israel. So it already in this broad description, it means that according to this definition, main issue of anti-Semitism is critique of Israel. That's the core of anti-Semitism, not far right, not racism. It's only, this is the core issue. One of the examples of the 11 example, for example, regarded as anti-Semitism, denying the Jewish people the right to self-determination by, e.g., by claiming the existence of the state of Israel is a racist evil. As we have seen, this is the core of the Palestinian national narrative, anchored in the anti-colonial discourse that Zionism, by taking over the land, perhaps a special brand of settler colonialism. So it claims, so the definition, this example claims that Zionism, let's put it like this anti-colonial narrative of Zionism claims that Zionism is a racist settler colonial movement, and therefore, like in America, like Australia, like all settler colonial states, and actually not only settler colonial states bear allegations of racism. Today almost every state, there is the progressive, I would say, every state has to bear progressive allegation or charges of being racist. But in this context, saying that the state of Israel is a racist endeavor, that is anti-Semitism, means that the basic Palestinian claim that Zionism is a racist colonial movement, and therefore it strives to dismantle Jewish supremacy regime in order to replace it by another one, is anti-Semitic. Now, this does not mean killing the Jews or throwing to the sea. It just means rearranging the political setting so it will be more egalitarian. Now, how this should be, how the alternatives, one state, two state, confederation, many Palestinian, there are many ideas, but the idea that Zionism is a settler colonial movement, or at least partially settler colonial movement, and a discriminatory settler colonial national ideology is completely delegitimized. And indeed, it has become more and more difficult for Israel, that is my opinion, to justify its occupational policies that are by now annexational policies, and its fundamentally discriminatory constitution as a Jewish state, which was entrenched, for example, in a 2018 nation-state law, and by dozens of other discriminatory laws against Palestinian citizens of Israel. It is also become more and more difficult to explain within any liberal discourse the 1948 Nakba, which is considered by many, myself included, as an ethnic cleansing. At this point, it resorts to anti-Semitic card within the Holocaust global narrative, which proved exceptionally helpful.
because it diverts the discussion from Israel's at least partially settler colonial nature and its subsequent mass violation of human rights to a debate whether saying this is in itself anti-Semitic. Now we are full circle and we can return to the question with which we began. When we think today on signifiers like uniqueness and anti-Semitism, in the sense of the so-called anti-Israel related anti-Semitism, and the completely different meanings they bear in different contexts, as we saw at the beginning, it is because they are understood very differently by different players who serve different purposes vis-a-vis their position within this clash between these two global narratives, the Holocaust and the colonial narrative, which, as I said at the beginning, clash most forcefully on the issue of Israel-Palestine. For Israel, who promotes this discourse forcefully, it's a matter of self-justification for its least partial settler colonial nature. For Europeans, and particularly for Germany, who since 2008, Merkel Knesset speech made the identification with Israel, it's part of reason of state, it's raison de Staat, it's a fundamental in consolidating its identity and its politics. There are obviously those who try to bridge these two narratives in the German or in the Palestinian-Israel context. We can name many, like Jürgen Zimmerer, Charlotte Wiedemann, Michael Rothberg, Stephanie Schuler-Springorum, and more, generally the initiative Gege 5.3 Weltoffenheit. And I believe also my work with Bashir, and I can pass now the book, on the Holocaust and the Nakba belong to this group, because what we do is try to frame, to articulate a historical and conceptual frame where we can bring those two mega narratives and their local interpretation of Zionism and the Nakba, of Israel and the Nakba together. So I can pass it, you can see it. However, all those works are usually rejected, oftentimes vehemently, by mainstream academia, media, and of course, political circles. The gap seems today bigger than ever. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Amos Goldberg, for this unique presentation of your thoughts, how to bridge the two narratives, if I understood you right. And I think nobody contextualizes these two narratives in the German debate as clearly as you did now. Thanks a lot.